Okay, that confirms that. So, just for those who may not heard of the Southern Partnership, it's hosting a series of talks between August and March 2023, based very much on Donald's project here in Talla-Hartfell. The talks are going to focus on topics of relevance to communities in the Talla-Hartfell wildland area, and Donald's going to say a little bit more about that in a minute, and on things of relevance to communities across the wider Southern Uplands, kind of challenges that communities are bumping into. Just briefly, the Southern Partnership has been actively working to promote a truly sustainable approach to living in the south of Scotland since 1999. This means giving equal consideration to social, economic and environmental needs. And in 1999, that wasn't necessarily, an accepted message. The environment was always left out of consideration. But now that's becoming increasingly recognised as the only approach that will help us meet the biodiversity and climate change needs of future generations. So, both social, economic, and environment working together is the only way that we're going to sustain living in Southern Uplands. Okay. So, Donald, can I introduce you to the audience? I'm Greg, who's working on the Talla-Hartfell Wildland Area Project. And I think you're going to say a brief few words about that, Donald.
Thank you. So, again, thank you very much, first of all, for coming. Thank you to our speakers, in particular Simon, who has come down from the Inverness today, and to Emily, and to our chair, Chris. Thank you to you for coming, whether it's in person or online. And also to everybody in Tweedsmuir for hosting us and letting us welcome use these facilities. Before I say something about Talla-Hartfell, I'd like to mention briefly the fact that there are more talks being organised. So if you enjoy this evening's technical hitches aside, then do come back for more. At the moment, we have one confirmed date which I can give you, which is later in the year on Wednesday, the 9th of November, when we'll be hosting a talk on forestry with guest speakers Stuart Goodall, who's Chief Executive of Cropton, and Maura Patterson from Communities for Diverse Forestry. And I'll say a little bit more about other potential topics just before I finish. As Chris said, all of the topics in this series have been selected because they're relevant to the communities of the Talla-Hartfell Wildland Area project, not to mention the communities of the broader Southern Uplands area in general. We know this because I've spent around 18 months talking to stakeholders and residents across the project area about how they see its future, and in particular, what the concerns and opportunities may be in the coming years. The Talla-Hartfell project first got going in 2019 when the Southern Uplands Partnership commissioned a report from SRUC Consulting Division looking at the economic status of an area demarcated roughly by Moffat up to Tweedsmuir, in fact up to Stanley, down to the Gordon Arms, Yarrow, and then over to Ettrick. At the heart of that area is the NatureScot Talla-Hartfell Wildland area. Broadly, what the SRUC report concluded was that the agricultural output in the area is gradually being replaced by forestry. And looking ahead for the next 10 years, this is a trend which the report expects to continue, with attendant impact on local employment, culture, and social cohesion. So it's a question of sustainability, especially for small communities. Taking this report as a thought-provoking starting point, I was asked to speak to as many people as possible across the area, plus interested parties beyond, to find out how they view its future. And I would stress that neither the Southern Uplands Partnership nor I had any agenda other than to scout opinions. Our aspiration was that we might be able to identify any common concerns that emerged, on the basis of which it might be possible to secure funding to take forward an initiative to help address those concerns. And I'll just add, if you haven't seen the SRUC report, it can be found on the Southern Uplands Partnership website, sup.org.uk. And if you look under current projects under the drop-down menu at the top, it will take you through it. So after 18 months or so of working on this project, a number of common themes have indeed been surfaced. And so we decided that one of the ways we could take forward an initiative would be to organise a series of talks in the hope that we could either start a conversation or help bring additional focus to an existing conversation amongst residents and stakeholders about the issues that the area faces as we look to the future. The topics of these talks are drawn from the issues of concern that have been voiced. This evening's topics and speakers, Simon focusing on the NatureScot wildland area itself, and Emily on the possibility of creating a Scottish Borders biosphere, have been selected because in the course of conversation with people, I was struck by the fact that although we have in the Talla-Hartfell wildland area a valuable asset, relatively few people are actually aware that it is there, or of its potential to help to generate both interest in and potentially income for the area, particularly if, as expected, natural capital becomes an integral part of economic development. In tandem with this, the Southern Uplands Partnership commissioned Emily to scope the possibility of creating a Scottish Borders UNESCO Biosphere. And it therefore seemed timely, while considering potential future developments, to present the findings of Emily's work and to consider it alongside the concept of the wildland area. You may be interested to know that some of the other issues that have been raised include the following: habitat management and restoration, wildlife, farming, rewilding, walking, in particular path creation and restoration, and signposting, and problems within experienced walkers, cycling, in particular route creation and local facilities, tourism, in particular unmanaged camping, and the potential to develop managed tourism, lack of public transport, food provenance, wind farms, lack of employment for young people, cultural heritage, community breakdown, disused buildings, inter-community cooperation and collaboration, and accommodation. That's some list. Before I finish, therefore, I would ask that if you have a topic which you'd like to see being explored through one of these talks, then please do get in touch and let me know. Thank you, and I'll hand back to Chris now.
So it's my pleasure now to introduce our first speaker, Simon Brooks. Simon was a colleague of mine when I worked at Scottish Natural Heritage, and we worked collaboratively on a number of topics, including landscape, particularly in the south of Scotland. So it's really good that Simon has come all the way from Inverness today to talk to you this evening. Simon is currently a strategic planning manager with NatureScot, with a focus on supporting good development, promoting good practice and encouraging developers to do more for nature. He's worked in a variety of planning and landscape roles with SNH and NatureScot over many years, and amongst other things, leads their work on wildland. This identified Scotland's wildland areas back in 2014, which is when Talla-Hartfell came about. For the past 30 years, Simon's lived in the Highlands and doesn't get the opportunity to come south as much as he would like. So, Simon, it's always like this down here. So why don't you come more often? Over to you, Simon. We're going to talk about wildland area, Talla-Hartfell, and Scotland's wildland.
Okay, right. Well, thanks, Chris, for that. Welcome, and well done to everyone both at home here for coming to hear this on such a lovely evening. I think it would be better to get out on wildland area, isn't it? So really appreciate it. So. Just a quick, this is the advert. So I work for NatureScot. Some of you may be more familiar with it as Scottish Natural Heritage. It's known as for almost 20 years. We changed our name a couple of years ago, but we're still essentially the same organisation. And this is how we describe ourselves these days, a nature agency. For those who don't know about us, we're government funded, we're an advisory body. We cover nature, landscape, recreation issues, and wildland is something we put a lot of effort into, well, the last 20 years, but in order to lead up to the lack of work that I'm going to talk about this evening. So this is what I want to cover this evening. 4 topics I'm going to run through reasonably quickly, hopefully, so that I think there's quite a lot to get through. I want to talk about what wildland is and this idea, concept of wildness. So we're all starting from the same point. I want to talk about the work we've done on mapping, some of the issues it's raised and the difficulties. Briefly touch on this particular wildland area down here in the borders, Galloway, and then just go out some ideas about where we are in terms of its position in policy at the moment. So firstly, what is this thing called wildness and wildland? And we do distinguish it between these two ideas, these two concepts. And wildness is that quality that can be enjoyed out there, and wildland is, I guess, those areas where it is best experienced. And in work we've done, we've talked about this being limited to those most expensive areas. So these are the best that Scotland has. That's our view, but we recognise that it actually is still a quite a contested concept. There are people who, on one hand, are real enthusiasts about wildland, and there are others who would actually say that, well, Scotland really hasn't got any wildland. And I want to touch on some of those issues so you understand where the debate has come from over the past, well, I'd say my working life, 30 years, but I know it's been going on longer than that. So firstly, one of the things that's contested about this idea about wildness and wildland is that this is really ignoring the influence that humankind has had on these areas. It really isn't anything that natural. And particularly with the Scottish cultural history, there's often this debate about, well, are these really empty areas or have they been emptied? Particularly a sensitive topic in the Highlands. So that's why we use quite deliberately this term wild land. We're not calling this wilderness. We know that there is an imprint of our actions on these landscapes, some of which is still there ready to be seen. Other places, you need to be more knowledgeable to actually pick it out. But these are areas that both had use in the past and they continue to have use. So we've got an example of hydro development. We've seen a lot of that over the past 10 years. The traditional sporting estate that goes on across a lot of the Highlands. Obviously, evidence of past settlement, both temporary, seasonal, as well as permanent, can still be found in these landscapes. And as I said, there's this cultural legacy of some of these landscapes having been cleared in the past and the injustices of that that's been left behind. And it is still very much debated. This is an example of how an artist reacted to our work when we published it in 2014, sort of reminding us that actually there is this cultural overlay that we have been criticised for in trying to say it's not really captured in the work we've done with mapping. So we recognise this and we are sensitive to it. We're not trying to brush that under the carpet, pretend it hasn't been there, you know, but you know, it is there as part of the debate as we go forward. Second issue that's often raised is that Scotland really isn't that wild. We don't have wilderness here, so why are we making an issue of it? Why are we trying to put labels on these areas of land? If we look at a global scale, I think it's fair to say, well, yeah, we don't have wilderness, not in some of these sorts of huge African savannas, etc. You know, UK, not much in Europe, comes up with this definition of wilderness. But this is a definition, you know, they looked at areas that are more than 1 million acres. That's a large area. You know, that's more than 100 times some of our smallest wildland areas, or more than 2.5 times even the largest that we have here in Scotland. So I think it's fair to say, okay, we don't have that kind of resource here in Scotland. If you zoom in and look at Europe though, you start to see there are some areas you can just make out, if you zoom in to the Cairngorms, that this sort of starts to come through as blue. So some of the top 10% of wildness, as it's been measured in these studies, coming through. So Scotland does have a resource that is comparable when you look at the European context, so a much more urbanised setting. But it's still not the most extensive areas even by European standards. Zoom in further into the UK and let's look at this, and this really does bring out, I guess, Scotland's place when you think about this concept of wildness. You know, you obviously get the areas you'd expect to see, the north and west and the Highlands and Cairngorms. And I guess this we recognise when we think about, well, so Scotland's got this resource and it's actually quite widely recognised. And then the third concern then, if it's recognised and there's a label put on it, does that actually restrict the potential use of these areas? And this is perhaps where there's been the strongest debate over the past sort of 10 years since we've done our mapping work. The train spotting example, I don't know if there's any fans of train spotting, the first train spotting film, I should say here. If you've seen the film, you might remember they go out to Corral Station, then you get two of the characters having quite different reactions to the landscape. One who's very enthused by it all, thinks this is a wonderful asset for Scotland, and the Ewan McGregor character, excuse the language, says it's slightly in Scottish, but he goes on to say something along the lines of, and criticise lots of things, but saying, it doesn't matter how much fresh air you get, it doesn't make any difference. And I'm just using that as an example to try and bring out that there is this quite broad range of views about the values that are attached or ascribed to these areas. So whose values do we want to follow? Or do we want to give credence to? And I suggest these are some that are pretty widely recognised. I don't think anyone would deny that, you know, wildness is part of our, you know, Scotland's identity, in our culture as well, not just in terms of its landscape, but in its people. And that's supported by work we've done. Its refuge, these are large areas of natural, semi-natural habitat, and increasingly they are seen as very important refuge for some of our most important species. We know these areas are used to varying degrees by people that go out and recreate in these areas. They also take something from actually knowing these areas are out there and they exist. So it is good for our health and well-being. And it supports our economies, and that's both at a national level, but also for the communities, the local areas around them, and particularly where there is some employment attached to the activities that go on in these places. And then finally, it provides a set of ecosystem services, and I think, you know, the debates we're seeing increasingly now around the climate emergency, the biodiversity crisis, I think these are increasingly coming to the fore about how important these are you know, not just now, but going forward. And I mentioned that there is support for this. I haven't just made that up. We have done various surveys over time. This shows a series of quarterly surveys we did over 5-6 years. The red and green are sort of showing, do people strongly support or support this question that we're being asked? And this particular question is that should Scotland's areas be protected? And you know, we've got from a survey that is takes an example of, you know, is trying to match the Scottish population. This isn't just wildland goers. This isn't people who are particularly concerned. This is just a cross section of the Scottish population. We get this continued high level of support, and on other questions that we've asked around wildland as well, it's come through very strongly. And then finally, and I get this is what I'm going to be testing on when I talk about the mapping work we've done, we get criticised, what's been criticised is that it's all just too subjective and vague. It's like trying to nail down jelly. I accept it's subjective, no one pretended it's not, but actually that might be one of its strengths because it relates to people. It's not something scientific and specialist. I think everyone can have a view on it. But if it's subjective, I think that puts the onus on any work you do around this area of making sure you are quite clear about what you're doing, your decisions, your judgments that are made are transparent. But this isn't new. This is something you can take from the debates that have come, you know, from the USA, where there's been very strong debates around wildness. And Nash, who's, you know, a celebrity in this area, you know, a quote from him saying, "One man's wilderness is another roadside picnic ground." It's recognised even amongst the people who are very focused on wildland that there is this range of views. So where does this leave us, you know, NatureScot government agency, if there are those range of issues and recognition that, you know, is contested? And I'll summarise it here in terms of this is how we've tried to take forward the debate around wildness and how it should be cared for. So as I said, we talk about wildland, we're not talking about wilderness. We recognise there is this cultural overlay, we recognise there is this use of these areas. They aren't the wildest, or you know, they aren't wilderness, you know, comparable to you get even in the American continents and African continents, etc. But within the Scottish and UK context, there's definitely something that Scotland has that you can't find elsewhere. They are a significant asset. Chris O'Donnell sort of used that word as an asset. They are, you know, they do bring these benefits, and you know, we need to think carefully therefore about how we want to maintain that asset. I say it's a people-centered concept. So it tries and merges people and nature. It isn't just looking at, if you like, what nature's in these areas. This is approaching these landscapes through a lens that thinks about how people react to these landscapes. And finally, these are sensitive areas that require some level of appropriate management for, you know, recognition in decision making. And that's why we felt there was a need to map these areas so that decisions can be informed by, you know, if you know you've got an asset there and a resource, it helps to inform the decisions that you then make about how we care for it going forward. So, moving on to the mapping work we did that finally led to the wildland areas that has already been mentioned. We've had several goes at this. It's been debated for a long time. Wildland was just talked about in a very vague way. It wasn't a map, there was no formal map. I'll show you some of the maps that have been produced since, well, this millennium. So, Scottish Natural Heritage, this is a map we produced back in 2002. And we called it search areas, because this at this stage is about, we wanted to get some debate about these wilder landscapes. We wanted people to have some discussion around how they should be cared for, but without a map, it was very difficult for people to think about that. So we produced this to prompt a bit of discussion. And then we did a bit of work with the Cairngorms National Park Authority, who were particularly interested in their wildland source. And this got down to a more technical approach using GIS mapping, Geographic Information System mapping, computers. And they produced this map, which is, it's a map of relative wildness. And this was the basis, or this informs all of the sort of subsequent mapping that's been done, where it tries to capture, rather than specific areas, it says, well, how wild in relative is this area? So within a Cairngorms context, that's the map they produced, with the green areas being the wilder areas and the browner areas being less wild. Having done it with the Cairngorms National Park, we did a similar exercise with Loch Lomond. And then we blew it up and did a national study. So based on the similar approach, we had to adapt it a bit to make it relevant to a national study. And we came out with this relative wildness map back in 2012. But that wasn't, we didn't want to just sort of say there's this range of wildness out there. We wanted to actually try and tease out where we felt the most important areas were. And for that, we thought there had to be the most wild and actually the large blocks of these areas. That's what we were focused on in recognising the most important. So in 2013, we produced that, and we had some public consultation on that. And then finally, in 2014, we produced this map, which is a refinement of that earlier. And that's where we stand now, and that's where we have the Talla-Hartfell area now as being identified on that map. So I said that when Cairngorms started that map and came up with a relative map, that was the kind of start of the general process that we started on. They took some thinking, well, it wasn't our thinking, we had sort of brought it together from a range of studies and that. They said, well, what do we mean when we talk about wildness? What are the bits? What are the bits of this jigsaw that come together to make wildness? And we came up with this list of physical attributes, 5 of them. So these are things that can be seen, experienced in the landscape. You go out there and you can measure it to some degree. See naturalness, little evidence of contemporary land uses. So it's not agricultural fields, it's not commercial plantations. So lack of modern artifacts and structures in the landscape, buildings, roads, etc. It's rugged or physically challenging terrain, so it takes time and effort to get into these areas, and it's remote or inaccessible. And we said that those physical attributes that are out there, physical, you can go and measure them, they result in these responses. This is what people experience when they are in these landscapes. That's coming back to this idea about why I said it is a kind of people-centered concept. This is about how people enjoy it and experience these areas. If you take them together, that's what gives you wildness. You recognise that a lot of those attributes or criteria, if you like, they are absolutes. If you talk about a lack of something, it means there's a variety or a range that you can have there, which means that it causes difficulties then saying, well, actually, how much can you have before you lose that particular quality that you're trying to capture? So we bore that in mind when we started doing the mapping work. And there were three phases. So the first phase is about mapping relative wildness, and this is those green and brown maps that we've seen several of already. And we took each of those physical attributes, because those are physical, they can be measured. And we said, well, can we map them? Can we measure them you know, if we've got data in our geographic information system, can we kind of map them and measure how much there is there? So we broke it down. So we took those 5 physical attributes and we bundled it. Oh. No, sorry, so we bundled them into 4, just to simplify it a bit because they were overlapping in what we were going to measure. And we did this analysis at a very fine scale. This is down to 25 metre or 50 metre squares on the ground. You know, that data exists on your computer. You can analyse it at that level. So we said, well, we talk about perceived naturalness, how people respond to that. We looked at what the land cover is, and you know, gave it a scale. We awarded scores to it. And we did that for all the 25 metre squares all across Scotland. And then we did something similar for the next criteria, which was landform. So again, that looked at you know, how challenging it would be to move across an area by applying a rule or calculation to it. If your hill goes, you might go to the Mason's rule about calculating how quickly it takes to walk up a hill because of the slope and the distance. So you do that, the computer works it out for you, and it takes into account slope and you know, if there's a track, that means you can walk faster. If it's just across rough ground, you go slower. Remoteness. So this was again measuring it from the public road. So this is saying that, you know, people can't drive into these areas. You know, they need to park at the edge, or in the example of the Carrara station, it was used in train spotting, get off the train. You know, so that's your starting point from where you have the mechanised access. And then the 4th layer was this lack of modern artefacts and structures, things like buildings, tracks, roads, masts, and of course wind farms. And that looked at the visibility of those. So how many of these, you know, the extent to which they're going to be visible across a landscape. And you know, you can do a calculation for that layer as well. So we did all that, and then we overlaid them together in a similar way, and that brought out this map of relative wildness. So this gave us a starting point for thinking about how much wildness and where it occurs across the country. But we wanted to go further than that and identify, well, what the most important areas are. So this is phase 2 of our mapping work. Don't need to worry about, I don't understand some of this stuff because it does get into some difficult statistics. But the first question we asked is saying, well, if we've got all this, you know, where do you draw a line around certain areas in the values? Because you have wildness on a scale of 0 to 256. So we had to do some statistical analysis, and this was called Jenks analysis, and it broke the data down into 8 categories, and that helped you understand where areas were very wild and where areas were not wild. And we then said, well, if we've got those areas, are there very large blocks? And again, the computer can work this out for you, and it can do the size of the blocks where there is very large, like where you've got lots of strong wildness, but a large block of it. And it calculates that for you. And then we said, well, okay, we've got all these blocks of wildness and they're of varying size. So which are the ones we're most interested in? Where do we want to, if you like, you know, scrape the cream off, the ones at the top of the scale? So again, that was another question we had to ask, and did a calculation on that. And then finally, and I think this is the most important stage, because that was all very data-driven and rules-driven. It was done by the computer. We wanted to bring the human side into this because we know there are limitations to that approach. Whilst it has a lot of advantages because it's repeatable and it's transparent, people can see the rules, you know, that you're applying. We also want to say, well, actually, does that make sense? You know, and we did a sense check on this. And are the areas that this process, this method that we developed, you know, that was spurting out results at the end, does that actually make sense? So just as an example, the areas that you can see on the screen, which we've just got a blue line now, they were identified as potential wildland areas. But with a sense check, and we used our sort of area colleagues, people on the ground, who looked at this, said actually, there's something about those areas that doesn't quite make sense, and these being the very best of Scotland's wildland resorts. So if you look out at the Outer Hebrides, north of Lewis, the area there's a lot of peat cutting and tracks that go in, just as it's mapped. Our data wasn't picking that up. And so they're saying, that really doesn't have that sort of, the perceived naturalness is going to be much lower there. It's not really coming through in the methodology we had selected. So there was kind of a sense check and bringing in those judgments to check that what we came up with was appropriate. And then we had to, having had these computer generated areas, we wanted to simplify this, because wildness, once you look at this and at a very fine scale, I think 25 metre by 25 metre squares, and that's what the computer does. You don't appreciate landscape like that. You see it in its wider context. So we wanted to simplify that when we actually identify these areas and drew boundaries around them. And we just used recognisable features that we felt on the ground that might be relevant to how you experience these areas as you move into these areas of wildland. So it might be a break of slope. It might be a recognisable change in land use beyond the forest stage, etc. And also where we're getting detractors, and I know that's a pejorative term, but where those are things such as built structures that will detract to a degree from your experience of wildness in these areas. We try to exclude those as much as possible where they occur towards the edge of these areas. And this is the map we ended up with in 2014, 42 wildland areas, just under 20% of Scotland. Perhaps not that surprising, given how important wildness or these, these natural landscapes we have is to Scottish identity. And nearly 2/3 of these areas already have some other national designation. So that might be a national park, it might be a national scenic area, it might be a European biodiversity designation, such as special area conservation, or a site of special scientific interest, etc. So national designations and international designations, they're already there. When you look at the map, you obviously see that there's a north and a west focus in that, perhaps reflecting of the terrain and what you all know about these landscapes. And we've also got quite a few areas, I think there's 11, that are actually on islands. So it's a range. And as we'll come down further south, we'll see we've got 3, south of the Highland Belt before the central belt. So just zooming in a bit then to this particular wildland area, and I'll be honest, it's not an area I know at all. I haven't been in there. I've driven around the edge of it and looked in on numerous occasions, but I've never actually been and experienced it. So I'm not going to say that much about it, because I think you'll be the experts about this area. But thinking about this, and the areas all towards the south of the central belt, it's just taking me an hour to drive down from Edinburgh, just over an hour, very close to census population. I think, within 2 hours of all the central belt probably here. It's not particularly big, it's what, 17 kilometres long, 9 kilometres wide at its widest. So it's not one of the largest areas that we have. This is an extract of the analysis we did, the Jenks analysis, which tried to group scores that we were getting. And when we were identifying wildland areas, the areas that are red and green, so 7 and 8 on this plan, those were, if you like, the most important bits to get over the first hurdle to be considered as a wildland area. And then recognising that wildness tends to increase as you move into an area. You know, as you get away from the edge, you start to lose more evidence of our management around in the surrounding countryside. It takes more effort to get in, so it becomes increasingly remote, etc. You know, so you get some lower scores in all of our areas. So it's not just these 7 and 8 scores. You know, you get the lower scores, and here you're starting to pick up, I think, the small glens at the edges that sort of run in, where there's more evidence of management and obviously access being easier in those areas. But that gives you a feel for what our computers are telling us about that strength of wildness across the area. One other thing we did, as well as the mapping, so after we'd identified these areas, was we got contracted 2 people to go out. I thought it was a great job to go out, and they went and did descriptions of all 42 of our wildland areas. They did a lot of field work, so our mapping work was all desk-based, you know, done in front of the computer, etc. This was the first time somebody had the specific task to actually go out on site, so looking at these areas and come up with a description of what was particularly unique about each of the individual areas. And they came up with this description of wildland qualities. It's not particularly long, I think for Talla-Hartfell it's only 4 pages. And you know, these are the 4 headline qualities. Underneath it, there's more description about how they came up with these headlines. But this is what they're saying were the distinct qualities about this particular area. So as I said, compared, you know, we've got 42 wildland areas, we've only got 3 in South Scotland. So you know, it's a rare resource down here in the south. So Merrick, which I think you're probably familiar with, not that far away, and then Waterhead, Wimbleshall, back up towards Glasgow. As I said, the size, I think it's about the 10th smallest, I think, in our list of the 42 that we had. So not that large. The largest is over 150,000 hectares. So that gives you kind of the range, the scale that they have. And then, whilst Talla-Hartfell has some existing designations, it's certainly not the most designated. I think about 20% of the area is covered by these national designations. So it's the SAC and the SSI, which covers the same area. But it also has these local or regional designations by, you know, the local authority, special landscape in the regional scenic area. So although they're different made, they're essentially the same sort of designation in their planning document. And I'm sure you can tell me that they're quite popular for walking, whether just a casual walk or for people who are out bagging their Corbetts and Donalds down here. So, you know, they will have that use as well as the ongoing management use that is there at the moment. And then finally, I just want to touch on where wildland areas sit in policy terms. So when we produced the map in 2014, Scottish Government saw this as a useful aid to the planning system. A lot of the debate over the past 20 years has been around wind farm development and the extent to which this might be infringing on this resource. So government saw this as useful. They put it into their planning policies, the National Planning Framework, which is their kind of the National Spatial Plan for all their other policies, and then with specific how it's applied in practice in this document called Scottish Planning Policy. And I've underlined, so this is my highlight, and I've underlined just some of these key words about government's thinking and approach to what these areas are. So they do have strong protection, they are a nationally important asset. They're not a designation, so they're not a formal designation like sites of special scientific interest or national scenic area, national parks, etc. They're just a policy tool. But nonetheless, they are seen as nationally important. They are seen as sensitive with little or no capacity for development, but they aren't no-go areas. They do accept that development and management will go on in these, but it needs to be appropriate, it needs to be done sensitively, and the impact on the qualities found in these areas need to be considered thoroughly. So that was 2014, and you may be aware that government is at the moment going through a process of refreshing these. We're about to get a national plan framework 4 in the autumn, and that's going to pull together those two documents I just mentioned, the national plan framework, social plan policy. We're all going to be in the same document. So we're waiting to see what that will say when it's finally published. We've seen the draft, some of you may have commented on it. Wildland is in there with policy protection, a very different policy nowadays, but perhaps a clearer one. So they are still wanting to see that given some safeguards. But that's in a broader planning balance. It's still not a no-go area. Development can happen in these areas. And increasingly what we're seeing coming through in policy terms, that is going to be, I think, bringing up sort of more debate around these areas and how we want to manage these going forward, is our reaction to the climate emergency. How are we going to make best use of our land? How are we going to adapt management on these areas? Peatland restoration is obviously a big issue. I mean, this peatland in this area, it's not the one that's got the most peatland compared to some of the other wildland areas, but as a carbon sequestration, carbon store, that's a real asset that these areas will have. And there'll be debated with the increased forestry targets, but where do you put that forestry? Does some of this need to go in some of our wildland areas? I've mentioned the nature crisis already, and we are getting yet another strategy, Scottish Biodiversity Strategy, later this year, which again is going to give more oomph, more prominence to the acting to dealing with this loss of nature that we are seeing, and how we manage land better. And there are going to be targets coming along in a couple of years' time that will be statutory targets. So government agencies like NatureScot will have to make sure we achieve those targets. So again, it's back to how do we make best use of wildland areas going forward. And the 30 by 30 reference, that's his government commitment that to have 30% of Scotland, well, UK, but also the Scottish government's made its own commitment. 30% of Scotland sort of safeguarded and protected by designations or other forms of management. So again, that's going to put a focus on things such as wildland areas as a particular tool for helping deliver government objectives. And I say opportunities or potentials because clearly we still need to do all the other things that society expects us to deliver. So rural development, that's always been one of these issues around the wildland debate. So how do we ensure that rural communities can still be socially and economically prosperous whilst you still have these safeguards in place? And repopulation is a specific issue that government is wanting to do more work on in our rural areas. And then there's land reform as well, which again looks at these areas, particularly in the Highlands, where you've got large parts of the Highlands under single ownership, etc., and what the appropriate management then. Are there opportunities, for making more of these areas that bring in things, deliver more for communities? And I say others because there's actually quite a long list. If you start looking at land management frameworks, etc., it goes on. So a lot of the information I've touched on is on our website. So if you just get onto our website, www.nature.scot, and if you put in wildland, it will bring you up to the development page. You can look at more of the details. You can actually download the descriptions of the Talla-Hartfell wildland areas, etc., and have a look at that in detail. So there's more information there if you want to look at it. And hopefully that's giving you some useful background and information around how we've ended up with this wildland areas map and the work that's gone into producing it. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. We've got time for some questions. So I'm going to say for anyone who's online, can you raise your hand on your device and we will let you in to ask your question. And anyone in the hall who wants to ask a question, please say please. No. Yes.
I've got a question. I was interested that on the, I think the penultimate slide, you mentioned forestry, and that forestry might be something that would be considered in terms of development within a wildland area. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that, because I suppose that seemed, from the rest of your presentation about what, what constituted wildland, that seemed a little bit at odds to me.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. So I think I put forestry up there in a done land definition. So not necessarily we're talking about commercial production forestry, it could be trees. But there is certainly part of government increasing its aspirations for how much planting is going to go in. There's a discussion around where do we put it. Now, on the one hand, clearly some of our wildland areas are just not suitable for planting. We know that, certainly not commercial planting. If anything, some of them are seeing the trees coming out because they haven't done well at all. But with Talla-Hartfell, you all know better than I. You've got a very real example there of woodland going in that I would suggest is actually enhancing that experience of wildness. So they're not incompatible. They can be good bedfellows, I would suggest, if it's the right type of planting.
Any other questions? John?
I wonder if you could explain to us why the Tweedsmuir triple SI was taken out of the wildland area right at the very end, near the end of the process. You showed a slide where certain areas were excluded, and you spoke about the north end of Lewis as an example. Well, the little blue line around Tweedsmuir triple SI, which was pulled out, obviously at a pretty late stage in the mapping process.
Well, you'll have to help me with where the Tweedsmuir is. Is that the block of land over the other side of the road?
Yeah, it's kind of east end of the northeast end of the.
Yeah. Okay. So it wasn't the exercise specifically we were considering, but if I remember correctly, it was something about the area, the extent of the area was not that great. So whilst it was there, I should have said actually, when we came south of the central belt, the kind of threshold for extent of area we lowered because we recognised that the landscape setting down here was very different to the big expanse of the highland landscape you had further north. So even having lowered it, it is still, marginal in terms of the extent, and the wildness scores that the methodology was telling us wasn't adding up to, I think it was very dispersed, and I think there was something about the commercial woodland in that area as well. Is there commercial woodland there?
Maybe
Yeah, I need to go back to our report. So there is a report where we did explain what we've done with the 7 or 8 areas that we had decided not to take forward. But I can actually have a look at that now, so I've got it in my bag, and just remind myself of what was the reason for it.
Okay, thank you. John, thanks, Sam. Anyone online who want to ask a question, can you raise your hand? And I think you'll have to come on through the screen on we would see it, even if you're not got a camera. Okay. Any other questions in the hall? Yes.
Yeah, you showed a graph showing public support for wildland, and I think it went right to left, 2010, and by 2017, the current area is showing how many people disagree with the support for wildland had actually increased. Yeah. I just wonder what you think of that, or what you think is behind that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, that's the last one, I think, actually probably was the biggest decrease in the value at the end. And unfortunately, then those surveys, because it's part of a wider survey, We weren't asking that question just on wildland. There was a whole range of questions across our remit we were asking, and then that survey got stopped. So what do I think about it? Yes, it's slightly concerning that it's come down, but I would say it's perhaps a reflection of people thinking it's probably not just a simple black and white answer anymore. Those people are getting more aware of how we need to address some of the other objectives, such as wind farms, etc. But even at that level, it is still a very high level. You know, you are still talking about 70–80% who were still very supportive.
46%.
Sorry?
It was only about 46%.
That was the strong. Well,
Yes,
yeah.
and only about 20% weren't bothered.
Right.
So it was only 46% that strongly supported.
It was strong. Yeah, it was strongly agreed.
And then ambivalent.
No, well, then it was agreed. Then it was ambivalent. So that's why it was I think it was read and agreed that those two categories, say, are people agree to some degree to varying strength. So that is still quite a high level of support for and recognition, I would suggest, for this concept of wild land and doing something about it. With any public survey you do, I mean, you need to bear in mind that you're never quite sure what's in someone's head when they tick that box. So it gives you a feel for what the sentiment is, but it doesn't give you all the answers there.
I think that's quite fundamental in your mission, isn't it? Because I'm sure everyone here would agree that you have laudable objections. But one of the very concerning points is where you're making assumptions about people. Well, that might just be middle class, country loving people. And are you appealing to the urban population? And I feel that you need to explore that a little bit more. Why are more people not so supportive? And what can you do to address that? How do you stop the classism of the country just being for middle class people or country folk? And I think that is a big issue.
I would agree, it is a big issue, and we certainly haven't cracked that yet. No. So I do agree with you on that. But in terms of what the survey is telling us, it's not going to, that's why I said, it's not just going to the wildland courting audience. So the survey company that does it does a cross section. So, you know, they know how to do it to say we've got a cross section of the Scottish population so it's usually around about 1,000 people that they get as a sample in order to get that cross section. So it won't be just middle class that are responding to that.
So I have a question on the connection between the wildland and biodiversity. I haven't really explored that. And looking at the selection criteria, I don't see biodiversity as having any real impact. So you might be actually identifying the wrong areas in terms of supporting nature, supporting communities.
You're right in that. I wouldn't say there's no connection. And one of the criteria, remember, is talks about perceived naturalness. And the important word there is perceived, because that's why it's a people-centered concept, is that how people respond to these landscapes and where they see them, that it's on this kind of naturalist scale. So it's not saying these are the best places for nature, but I think it's sort of inherently in having identified these areas which are natural, semi-natural habitats. Actually, they are pretty good for nature, and the fact that we've got, well, I can't remember the breakdown, but I think it's something, so I mentioned that about 2/3 of all wildland areas, about 64% is already covered by a national designation. Now that includes national parks and NSA, so they are biodiversity, nature, you know, they aren't purely nature-driven ones. But I think if you just take the biodiversity type designation, you're still looking at around 40% of those areas, sort of up there or seen as nationally important. So you're right, they aren't, you know, it isn't a complete overlap, but there's a fair amount of overlap. And I think what I would suggest is one of the limitations at the moment of wildland areas is they aren't really recognising nature and its potential for biodiversity strong enough. So I would take that as fair criticism of this concept we've got. But it goes back to where wildness and wildland comes from in its approach. It's people-centred. You know, they're thinking about, you know, the experience they get. It's not about, you know, is this the best thing for biodiversity? So people will go out and, you know, listen to some of the Chris Packham stuff around grouse moors, etc. People can go out and they can get a very positive experience in the areas where there's grouse moors and management experience. But I think a lot of people recognise that that's ecologically, these aren't the best areas.
Okay, yeah, we need to draw the questions to a close. Can I just thank Simon very much for that presentation and answering those questions, Simon, and we'll go on now to Emily. So while Emily sets up, I'll just do a brief introduction. So Emily Cropton is a landscape architect and artist based in the Scottish Borders. She's particularly interested in the relationship between social and environmental systems, which spans landscape design, research, art practice, and workshop facilitation. Emily's worked with Southern Partnerships for the past 2 years, developing connecting threads. The cultural strand of the destination food initiative, which I'm sure many in this audience will have heard that, and the rather exciting news that has received HLF funding as a potentially larger project, which we hope might achieve its match funding and later this year. In 2021, Emily was commissioned by Southern Partnership to conduct a scoping study exploring the UNESCO Biosphere opportunity for the Scottish Borders. Some of you may know that there is a biosphere system in Galway right now, and this is looking at the opportunity in the borders. Emily teaches landscape architecture at Edinburgh College of Art and has worked as a commercial artist on landscape-based projects across the UK and Ireland. And Emily, you'll talk to us about the theatre of nature, connecting people and places through biosphere and borders.
Yes.
Over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Donald, for inviting me to talk today. I just wondered if I could start by having a quick show of hands of anyone who is familiar with UNESCO biospheres or the term UNESCO biosphere, just so I sort of know few people. Okay, but mainly those that organise the event. That's good. We're starting from scratch. Okay, so there will be quite a lot of information, so I'll try to keep it simple and brief where I can. I suppose what I want to start by saying, which Chris has already mentioned, is that the presentation I'm giving today was based on a study which I was commissioned to do last year for the Southern Uplands Partnership, which was really an initial study scoping the opportunity for a UNESCO biosphere in the Scottish Borders. The process of becoming a biosphere, which I'll talk about later, is a long one. It could be several years. So this was not a sort of really in-depth study as part of that. It was an initial stepping stone, seeing what might this look and feel like, what might it look like on the ground. And so this is something that's very much up for discussion. And so it's great to present to you tonight to get some feedback on what you think about the idea. So I've broken the presentation tonight down into 4 parts. I'll talk about what a biosphere is to start with, so we're sort of on the same page. And then I'll look at the Scottish Borders context, thinking about what in the Scottish Borders would make a biosphere appropriate here. I'll also talk about who is involved, both in the process of establishing one and in the biosphere once it has been established. And then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about the reception that we've had to the idea so far, and what the next steps might be. I'm not here to necessarily sell you the idea of a biosphere. It's more about informing people. It's a designation that not a lot of people know very much about, but I think it is quite exciting and offers a lot of opportunities for communities to take an active role in the development of the places in which they live. So, what is it? So, this is a statement for those of you that like a written statement. But essentially, and I suppose this does in a way sum it up. But I think what I would say is that a biosphere, a UNESCO biosphere, is a designation, like some of the designations that Simon has been talking about. But unlike some of the other designations, like the SSSI or SAC, it's not a statutory designation. It's not something that's written into law. And so the purpose of the biosphere isn't to put a title on an area and to put a label on an area. It's really a tool for use by communities and organisations and local governments that are looking after a region. It's a tool for those people to help them manage a place sustainably. And sustainable development is really at the heart of it. So going back to Chris's introduction at the start of the talks this evening, thinking about economic development, social development and the environment. So bringing those things together. And I think the way that UNESCO presents the biosphere is that they're testing grounds for sustainable development. They are places where we can try out different approaches, and then through research and monitoring, we can actually review how those approaches are working. So to give you an idea of where some of the biospheres are, UNESCO is a worldwide organisation, and so there are biospheres all over the world, but there are currently 7 in the UK, with another one in development or kind of going through that several-year-long process. And some of you may be familiar with the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere, which is just across the border. That one was set up partly with the support of the Southern Upland Partnership, but is now a completely separate organisation. And what I think it's important to say is when we think about these different areas, each one of these places is very different. Some of them are islands, some of them are coastal regions and actually incorporate some of the sea, some of them are inland. And each one is very different geographically, politically, socially. And so the UNESCO Biosphere tool, the designation, it's a very flexible framework. And so it enables places to bring their distinctiveness, what's locally distinctive to them, to shape what the biosphere is. Let's carry on like that. Okay. So, for example, the North Devon biosphere is based around a network of sand dunes and burrows, and it obviously also, you can see it extends into the coast. And there's a big focus there on tourism as well as biodiversity. Whereas in comparison, the Wester Ross biosphere is in the least populated, or one of the least populated areas in the UK, and its focus is much more on Cropton community and Gaelic culture in that area. So the biosphere enables places to bring their local identity and distinctiveness to the designation. So just to explain how the form of a biosphere might look, on the left here I've just got a simple diagram which I'll talk through, and on the right is a picture of the Galloway and southern ayrshire biosphere, just so you can sort of see how the diagram relates to the ground. The biosphere has three key areas. It has a core area at its heart, and that is an area which is already protected by law for conservation. So something like a site of special scientific interest, a SSSI, or a special area of conservation, an SAC, so designations which Simon spoke about. So this is not creating new law or legislation or planning legislation about what can happen in those areas. It's using existing sites at the core, and those sites are already protected. Around that, we have what's described as a buffer area, and then again the transition area. And the sort of the placing of those, the line which is drawn of the boundary, again, is a long process of community consultation. It's an iterative process to set up those boundaries for the transition area and the buffer area. But what those areas really are guiding is the type of activity that might take place in them. So if I go on to the next slide, we can think about the type of activities that might take place in a biosphere and how placing those into the biosphere helps us achieve our ambitions. So, for example, the core part of the biosphere, which is already designated, would be an area where there's going to be a new programme of research and monitoring. And it's this kind of ongoing research and monitoring which can help us to understand long term if our management practices are having a positive impact.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
So thinking about the activities that might happen in a biosphere, for example, if we're thinking about industry, that would be suggested. Again, there's not new laws created around what can and can't happen, but it would be the suggestion that that wouldn't happen in the core areas, for there to be heavy industry in those areas, but that could take place in the buffer and transition areas. Again, if we're thinking about recreation, something which has maybe less of an impact than industry. I haven't actually put that in the core areas, but you might have recreation in the core areas, but as well as the buffer and transition areas. So it's really thinking about the sensitivity of the landscape being, I suppose, most sensitive in the areas which are at the core and becoming less sensitive. So if we're thinking about the function of the biosphere, the function is essentially what these three phrases that we've got here: conservation, development, and then the logistic support to make that possible. And so the form is really guided by the function and how we can achieve that. I'll give some more examples in a moment, which I think will help make it a little bit clearer, because it is a little bit abstract. So I just wanted to give two examples of biospheres in other parts of the world to give you a sense of how these places are very distinctive. They're places which are built upon the identity of a place, what's the particular character of a place, and in some cases what's quite unique about the place. So this biosphere is in the Netherlands, and in this area there is an ancient system of quite small agricultural fields which are bounded by hedges, and that practice has been retained. And so they have now got this landscape, which is a working landscape, it's an agricultural landscape, but because of the hedge laying system and the use of these small fields, it's actually quite biodiverse. And so you've got the combination of a working landscape, which has high biodiversity and also high cultural heritage. And that is the basis of the biosphere here. The picture at the top right, which I really like, is they have an annual hedge laying competition, and that keeps the skills of hedge laying alive, or is one of the things which is helping to keep the skills of hedge laying alive in the area. And as it says here, it's the oldest and largest network of hedges in the Netherlands. The other thing that's particular about the biosphere here, you can see the river running through the middle, is that it actually extends both sides of the river, and each side of the river is a different province. And so the biosphere in this area has helped those two provinces to work together. The second example, which is quite different, which I wanted to give, is a transboundary biosphere, which covers 700 kilometres of river. It's 3 rivers, the Mura, Drava and Danube. And this is an area of high wildlife and biodiversity value. It's probably more similar compared to the other one, which was a working landscape. This is very much more of a kind of wild area, or wild type area. And that's really the focus here. It's an area of very low population density in comparison. And it has a number of endangered bird species, and is a particular site for migratory birds. So again, the focus of this biosphere is very different. It's very particular to what the assets are in that area. So if we now think about the Scottish Borders context, I think it's important to start by saying that, as we all know, the Scottish Borders landscape is not untouched. People have been interacting with this landscape for a very long time, and we've been actors in this landscape for a very long time. And some of that involvement has had a positive impact on the biodiversity that we see around us, but some of it doesn't. And I think the purpose of the biosphere is to think about what is this relationship we're having with the environment, with what we might call the natural world, and how do we want to shape that. We've been participants, but how are we participating? What is that relationship? And the kind of back and forth between us and the environment is really at the heart of this. As we know, in some parts of the Scottish Borders, there are increasing pressures on the environment. So things like forestry targets are putting certain pressures on the environment. There's management of grouse moors, which puts a different kind of pressure. With our river systems, we also have issues with invasive species, plant species, and also in some parts there might be inappropriate grazing. And so some of these pressures that exist are having an impact on the biodiversity that we have, and on the environment's ability to provide us with the ecosystem services which we need from it. So this, we've just got here a map of the Scottish Borders, and the reason I've put this up is because I wanted to highlight, I suppose, the significance of the water network to the Scottish Borders. What's interesting about this as an area is that if you look at the administrative boundary of the Scottish Borders and the area in blue, which is the River Tweed catchment, there is quite a close overlap in terms of how they sit. Now, that's obviously not necessarily a coincidence, but in other parts of the country, you often might have a river catchment which crosses multiple administrative boundaries. Here, you've got quite a close alignment, and that does provide us with an opportunity. It means it's easier for us to have a more integrated approach to our land and water management than it might be in some other places, simply because the catchment area is largely in line with the policies which the Scottish Borders Council and the people setting regulation in that area are going to promote. And so I think the other thing that's important to think about is what are the opportunities that the Scottish Borders context particularly lends itself to. So thinking back to, say, the North Devon Biosphere, which is based around this network of burrows, the Biosphere in the Netherlands, which has got its network of hedges. You know, what is it in the Scottish Borders which we want to draw on? And there are particular opportunities that a biosphere could bring. So, for example, is it that we would want to create a network of pollinator habitat along all of the SAC designated watercourses, for example? Is it that we want to focus on the adaptation of upland land uses to support livelihoods? Is it that we want to explore community ownership or management of fisheries and fishing beats? Or is it that we want to really promote regional e-bike hire and charging services to support both ecotourism and the decarbonisation of rural travel? So these are just some ideas, and it doesn't have to be one or the other of these. There can be lots of ideas which come together, but there does need to be some kind of focus. So I've just put it here. We've obviously got the Devil's Beef Tub, and we've got Rhubarb Fest, which I was sad not to be able to attend. But I was just starting to think about in this area, and I'll show you a map shortly, which shows the possibility of a biosphere focused on this area. I was thinking, okay, well, what creates the identity in this area? What are some of the activities that are taking place here, which starts to build what this place is about, what the values that the people here have, what the land is used for. So these are just some examples, but this is really a starting point, and this is something that the community would be involved in shaping, but starting to think about what that identity is. So, a few maps to share, and this was really the heart of the study that I did, was trying to scope out, okay, we've got the Scottish Borders area. This is a map here of the designations which are currently in the Scottish Borders area, remembering that we've got to have a designated area at the core of our biosphere. We've got to really design from the ground up. We've got to design with what we've already got on the ground. So we've got to choose one of these areas as our core, noting that not all of them are applicable. So the Talla-Hartfell wildland area, because it's not a statutory designation, that can't be our core. But the special area of conservation, the special protection area, and the site of special scientific interest, they can be our core areas. So what I did is I created this map to start with to see what we were working with, and then created 4 proposals, really just talking points as to what the biosphere could look like. So I'm just going to run through those 4, and we'll pay a little bit more attention to the one that focuses on the Tweedsmuir area. So the first one, which was kind of the most ambitious, if you like, was thinking, okay, well, how about we create a UNESCO biosphere which covers the whole river catchment of the Tweed and really focuses on the waterways that run throughout the area. Many of the waterways, all ones that are highlighted in dark green rather than blue, are designated with an SAC designation, a special area of conservation, which is this European designation. So the waterway itself, could that be the core? There are examples of other sites in Europe where they've used this idea of the waterway itself being the core. Now, one of the challenges we have with this model in the Scottish Borders, and actually in many places around the world, wherever you look, is that people have often settled along watercourses because of the resource that provides. And so actually, if you're thinking about trying to shape a buffer area where there is not too much industry, there's not too much settlement, there's not too much high impact activity, that's quite difficult because we've got quite a lot of large towns and settlements around our rivers. So for instance, you can see here, sort of where Galashiel sits above Selkirk, I've indicated that actually maybe at that point, it's a larger town and also around Hoyt, we might need to change the buffer area so that it doesn't include those places. Again, these lines haven't been drawn, you know, I haven't gone through a kind of system like Simon was talking about for the wildland area, we haven't got that far ahead. This is really indicative at this stage. But this is the idea of trying to bring the whole of the River Tweed management, River Tweed catchment management together to create this biosphere across the whole area. The second example, which I actually personally think is the strongest option, independent of this talk, is the one which is focused on this area, the upper part of the Tweed catchment. It's one of the areas in in the Scottish borders, which has the highest percentage, or the sort of, not the highest percentage, the largest, if you like, already protected areas. So what you can see indicated here is we've got the Moffat Hills Special Area of Conservation and the Tweedsmuir Hills SSSI. Those two sites form the core of our biosphere, those already protected areas. Then in the buffer zone, you've got some of the smaller communities which exist around that. So Tweedsmuir itself, Cropton, everywhere else that's along that main road, and then in the Ettrick Valley. And then outside that, in the transition zone, you've got where the larger towns are lying. That works quite well in terms of fitting with, when we were looking at the activities that take place in a biosphere, it works quite well fitting with that, that model, if you like. And so, again, going back to the image I showed where there was rhubarb fest, thinking about, well, what is the nature of this area? What is the character? Now, I think it's, you know, I'm sure everyone, well, I think, yeah, everyone who's local, aren't they? So, you know, obviously the Tweed Valley area from Peebles down to Gala, that does have quite a different character to the area up here. However, the core of it is in this part, and then that bit would just be in the transition zone. So you might be thinking about how people from that area are coming into this part, but the character of it is really led by perhaps what's at the core. The third example was then focused on the Tweed Valley. It was really thinking, well, okay, we've already got the Tweed Valley in the Scottish borders, which has quite a distinctive identity. It's being promoted a lot for tourism and recreation, and actually that there are impacts on the landscape and on the environment and on biodiversity which need to be considered and managed. Could a biosphere be used in this area to help manage some of those potential conflicts? Again, in that one, you have the river being at the heart of it. I think this is probably the weakest option. Not necessarily because it doesn't have a strong identity. I think it would have a strong identity, but I think the problem is that the sort of spatial, how it sits spatially on the landscape and the communities that it involves doesn't work very well in terms of how that aligns with what we're trying to achieve in a biosphere. And then the fourth option was really using this scattering of SSSI sites that you have, as well as the river designation, sort of in the real sort of central part of the Scottish borders. And it was an option which tries to take in almost as much of the larger populations as possible. So thinking about where the larger towns and villages are, and also taking into account that some of those places, particularly perhaps in Galashiels and in Hoyt, have some of the lowest Scottish index and multiple deprivation scores regionally, and whether the biosphere could be a way to help bring sustainable economic development to those places. So those are kind of four spatial options. If we now actually think about who is involved in this and how, I realised after putting this picture up that this is not a very diverse group of people. This is actually largely postmenopausal women, and that's not necessarily the message I'm trying to promote. But anyway, we've got a forum of people meeting outdoors. I think the first thing to say is that sometimes a biosphere gets a bit confused with a national park. And there is at the moment a campaign for a national park in the Scottish borders, some of you may be aware of. They are quite different things. And one of the key ways that they're different, and I think probably one of the most important ways, is the model of governance, how they are managed, how they are set up, how they're established. A national park takes a kind of regulatory model. It's often a kind of what we might describe as a more top-down model, and it involves planning regulation. there'll be a new authority brought in to an area that sits alongside the local authority to manage that national park. The way that the biosphere is different is rather than being a regulatory model, it's a participatory model, and it's built from the ground up. So there's no one sort of coming in saying, right, we're going to create a biosphere. This is something which has to be grown from the ground. And that whole process of growing it and then actually of managing it involves the community at many levels. And rather than it being, I suppose, governed by regulation about what you can and can't do in an area, there are no new regulations in a biosphere saying you can do this, you can't do that. It works on people being in a forum together, having dialogue and agreeing mutually the best way forward. Now, obviously, that's not a totally foolproof, fail-safe method, but it is based on conversation and dialogue and participation rather than legislation and regulation. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, the process of becoming biosphere is quite a long one. We've obviously created this small study, and the next step in that would be having wider conversations with communities like yourselves to see whether there was even an appetite for this type of thing to exist. But the process could take a long time, and whilst that can bring challenges in terms of funding, you know, how is this, how is it funded during its establishment? There are advantages in that it's a very iterative process. The little diagram that I've got on the right here is really trying to just show how much involvement local people can have in the management of the biosphere once it is established. So a biosphere, so for example, the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere, it has a small operational team that run it. So that's the people that we've got at the top there. Some of those people might actually be from the local area, they've been employed in that job, but they are kind of managing it on an operational level. But then at these other levels, on the partnership board and on the working groups, so even sort of at a strategic level, you've got the opportunity for local people to be involved in that and to have a voice, whether that's as an individual, as a business owner, as someone who works in a local organisation or community trust. I'm just going to quickly go back to my notes, which I've neglected. See whether I've got something. Yeah, so I think when creating a biosphere, what's got to be clear to the people who are creating it, and some of the questions which might arise are, you know, firstly, well, why do we want to create one? What problems do we think this might help us solve? Who's going to benefit? What will the benefits be to us? How are we going to use the idea of the biosphere in our daily life? How will it become a feature of how we live and how we interact with our environment? And also remembering that UNESCO is a worldwide network. So thinking about what might we bring to this worldwide network that we can share with others. I'll come on to that in a moment. I think one of the biggest strengths of a biosphere as to why we might want to create one is that, and again I'll come on to this a bit later, but is that there are a lot of initiatives that are happening, both, you know, in the Scottish borders, obviously elsewhere as well. Sometimes these initiatives, these priorities don't necessarily talk to each other very well. Sometimes they can exist slightly in silos, and there be not much dialogue between them. I think the thing that a biosphere can do is it can act as an umbrella which brings together people from this range of initiatives, range of priorities, range of voices into a room physically to make decisions collectively about how an area is going to develop. And it's that forum which I think is one of the real strengths of what a biosphere can bring. So you might be thinking, in this area, actually what are some of the things that we've got that are competing, that aren't really talking to each other? Have we got industries, or have we got voices which aren't really being heard as well, that we want to make more powerful? So another really key part of the biosphere, and I think actually one of the most exciting parts as well, is the idea of education and exchange. UNESCO is a worldwide organisation. A biosphere is a worldwide designation. And so as a biosphere, there is local participation, but there's also this global exchange, opportunities for global exchange, learning about how other parts of the world are approaching sustainable development. What management practices are they using in their environments? How are they protecting their cultural heritage? How are they supporting livelihoods of rural communities? All these things. And through the UNESCO Biosphere programme, there are opportunities for people from biospheres, communities from biospheres, to travel to other places in the world to go and have this exchange. And I think it's important to say that education happens in a number of different ways within the biosphere. And what is also key is some of the reasons why we might have education. Research, the decisions that you make within a biosphere, because there is a need for monitoring and research in that core area where you're really conserving and protecting the biodiversity, it means that you can then make informed decisions about how you manage the environment, about land management practices that you might be using. These practices are then going to be based on scientific evidence, if you like, about what's working, what's not. It allows you opportunities to test out different approaches and then monitor them and see how they work. Each biosphere doesn't have an education department as such, but what this enables is each biosphere to build links with research institutions. So, for example, universities, Scotland's Royal College, the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere has had links with universities in the Central Belt who've then come and done research in those areas, and that can bring funding into the biosphere as well. So I've just put up here some images of both some policy documents, but also just some other reports and management plans. I think there's a feeling, and when we spoke to people about what we were doing, there was a slight feeling of overwhelm about the amount of different initiatives, policies, plans that were in place in this area. You know, the last thing people want is some other plan or, you know, suggestion of how things are going to happen. And again, I think I'd go back to this point of the biosphere is not here to put another document into this kind of collage. The biosphere is really a tool to bring some of these things together, an umbrella under which some of these things can then sit. So as well as encompassing some of the existing initiatives, the biosphere can also help shape what future initiatives you might take on. So collectively, the people that are within the biosphere might help decide what type of investment they would like to see coming into the biosphere in the future. So just quickly, before we finish, just onto the reception. So when we did this study, we spoke to individuals from some of these organisations. It's really important to note that we didn't seek official views from these organisations, but we spoke to individuals who were working within them, and they provided their informed thoughts. So we haven't got sort of, you know, official letters of support, if you like, from these people. We tried to speak to a range of organisations. What you'll notice is that at this stage, we didn't speak to community organisations. We spoke more to people who were organisations operating in the area, already in the area of kind of land management and environmental management, and also tourism. I would say generally there was an intrigue about the idea of a biosphere. Not all of these organisations knew what a biosphere was before we spoke to them, so there was also the process of going through and explaining that. And there was an intrigue about it. There was a particular interest, I would say, from the organisations that have a focus on tourism. So the Scottish South of Scotland Destination Alliance, Go Tweed Valley in particular, and the South of Scotland Enterprise were interested particularly in how a biosphere could bring opportunities for sustainable tourism and kind of slow tourism, ecotourism, if you like. Organisations like the National Farmers Union were perhaps a little bit more cautious because of the link or the perceived link to it being a national park, which we're obviously trying to explain how they're different, but the wariness of it creating new legislation which would then restrict the agricultural activities. I think what's important to say is that with all these people that we spoke to, we didn't really identify any conflict with anyone else's activities. And I think one of the strengths of a biosphere is that it doesn't necessarily create conflict with other things that are going on. It can encompass things. And so actually, looking back at those policy documents, when we read through some of those policy documents, there were a lot of things which aligned with the aims of the biosphere, rather than being conflicting. And so the biosphere might be a way to bring those all together. So as I mentioned earlier, what next is really a case of trying to share the work that we've done to make people, to raise awareness of what a biosphere is. I think it would actually be really useful for people that were interested to maybe visit the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere, as that's so close by. And also because the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere has now had 2 years of reporting since it's been funded. We can start to see what impacts that might be having now that it's been kind of fully operational. We're also planning a meeting, myself and Kit from the Southern Partnership, hoping to have a meeting with the Sustainable Development Working Group, which is within Scottish Borders Council, to see what they think of the idea. But I would be really happy to share the full report, which goes into much more detail with anyone that wants it. It's just a digital PDF that I can email to you. And yeah, really welcome any questions. I'll try and answer them. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily.
That's right. Apologies for running a little bit late due to the technical glitches. Apologies to anyone who's still online. If you haven't seen the slides. Got time for a couple of questions? Anyone's got any? Yes.
Yeah, when we talk about the gallery national biosphere, sorry.
Yeah.
And you talked about the operational too.
Yes.
What would they be doing? I mean, what do they do? Like, what's their job?
Yeah, what sort of day to day? So I think a lot of it is about partnership building. They've actually recently grown their team. So originally it was only 2 people. I think it's now grown. They've actually just taken on 2 new younger, sort of not apprentice level, they're people both with degrees, but they're sort of under 25, I guess. So some of those people would be, one of those young people I know is particularly, their focus is around environmental conservation. So they might be trying to establish projects around environmental conservation with particular communities. The other young person that's come in is their background is in sort of business management. So one of the things they might be doing is trying to build relationships and partnerships with businesses in the area. So, for example, in the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere, they have developed one of the first things that they did after establishing was they set up a number of schemes to get businesses involved in the biosphere. Now, you might think, okay, well, we set up this biosphere, and at the heart of it is this area which is supposed to be all about biodiversity. But what the Galloway and Southern Ayrshire Biosphere decided was that actually, in order to be able to start bringing money into the biosphere to ensure that it could continue and it could grow in terms of its reach, they needed to attract people to it. They needed to get businesses to buy into it. So they developed a number of schemes which were aiming to do that. So I can't remember the name of them. One of them's called, you can basically become like a sort of biosphere supporter, which is where businesses buy into the idea of the biosphere. So say you're a B&B, you might buy into the idea of the biosphere. You might want to have the biosphere badge, and they're kind of almost like accreditation on your website, you know, that you're a biosphere accredited B&B. And what that might mean for you as a B&B is that when you're thinking about what you're buying for your breakfasts to cook for your guests, rather than just going to the supermarket or whatever, you might be making links with local producers who can provide you with food which is produced and sourced locally. So whether that's, you know, meat, whether that's eggs, bread, honey, jam, whatever. So creating those links between food producing businesses, for example, and the hospitality industry. So that would be one example of something that the staff in the Biosphere might be doing, is trying to forge those relationships. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Right, any other questions? Anyone online? Appreciate it. It's been quite difficult for folk online tonight. If there are no other questions right now, given that we're running quite late now, Emily, can I just thank you again? And I'll just say a couple of words and then we'll be finished. So we've heard a couple of things about designations tonight. They're actually not designations as such. But I know a question will be exploding in your minds is how many designations do we want for me, because we've heard about a lot of other designations in the process, talking about these. But these two concepts, wildland area and biosphere, are not the designation in the traditional sense, it's top down. They only exist because there's a consensus that we want to exist, in a sense, and they won't work if there isn't that consensus. I don't know whether the wildland area may help identify shared ambitions in this part of the world. That's the possibility that Donald is exploring. You know, do the ambitions from this community, are they shared with those from other communities who are on the edge of this area, because of the particular challenges of living in such a place? Have you got common cause with Electric or Fox and Moffat or some of the other smaller communities that all kind of sit at the base of this wildland area? There is the possibility of identifying some of those opportunities through the project that Donald is running, and we as a partnership will continue to help facilitate that kind of conversation. And the possibility of a biosphere in the borders could be an even bigger expression of shared ambitions, in a sense, on a whole partner catchment basis, or again in this western part of the Scottish borders. But if it comes off, it will be a choice for the people and the communities to make, as was the case I had with involvement in the biosphere development in Galloway. And at the end of the day, it had to have consensus from the communities. They opted in or out, whether they wanted to be in it or not. And at that level, it also had to have local authority engagement, and it also had to switch government approval, and then it had to have the UNESCO UK UNESCO approval. So there's many steps before you get to a point. And at each step you've got approved, you've got the support from the base before you get there. But then all these things are about, how do we cope? We all know we're dealing with crisis right now in economic sense, and many people are focused just on the day-to-day. But these things are about looking forward and how we cope with the future, actually. That future which is getting hotter, drier, more risks associated with it. Are there ways that we can work with nature to help us get through and for our future generations to get through? So that's really what these things are about. And hopefully what you've heard tonight is going to help the thinking in your minds about that, concerns that you might have, or the concerns that your community might have. And Southern Partnership is there to facilitate those kinds of discussions. So if you want us to do something for your community on that country, then get in touch, and we're happy to talk to you. Can I just thank everybody who's joined tonight, both online and in the hall, for coming and supporting this. This is the first of our talks, and there have been some technical glitches which we'll need to look at before the next talk, because that's going to take place here as well, I think. But we'll look at that and hopefully see some of you at the next discussion. But otherwise, thank you all very much for coming and joining online, and we will we'll have a safe journey home.